Well, hi everyone, and thank you for that introduction. I am here to talk to you about container queries. So a little bit about me, as you just heard, I am a first generation Ukrainian American, so this is an event that is very close to my heart. I do have family that is still in Ukraine, mostly in Kiev, so I'm really excited that I can be here and just do a small thing to help get attention and raise funds for your community, which I'm so grateful for. I am also a developer relations engineer. I lead the CSS UI and DevTools team, where we focus on anything that is styling in the browser, components, tooling, things that you need to debug web interfaces. And I'm a member of the CSS working group and Open UI community group, where we focus on the standards and explainers to resolve those things. How can we improve web styling for the community? These are some photos from just earlier on. I went to a few protests in New York City where I live, and the world is with you. So I'm really happy that we're having events like this. And I'm happy that we can start just doing small things in our small part of the world to help you in your part of the world. So I am here to talk about style sheets and CSS, and there is a lot going on in this space. If you've been following along, there's been a lot of landings. We have cascade layers. Today I'm talking about container queries. We've had scope styles coming out on the horizon, has the parent selector. There's so much going on, and you might feel a little bit lost floating out there with all of this going on. But I'm here to bring you back to earth and to show you one of the most powerful new tools that CSS has to offer. By the end of this talk, I want you to say, I love CSS, and understand how to use container queries, where you can use them cross-browser, what the current status is, and what they even do. So let's get into it. Today, we'll learn about container queries. What are container queries? How to use the @container rule, container units, what those are and how to use them, and types of container queries, as well as how to actually use container queries today. So what is a container query? A container query lets you as a user actually query and adjust styles based on any parent inside of a page. This is a big change from what we have to do today with something like media queries, where we only have one input, and that's the global viewport. So right now we can query for things like user preferences. We can query for a viewport's width or height. We can query viewport-based information, but that's sort of like a blunt hammer. It doesn't really let you have refined logical styles that are owned by components. With container queries, we can query individual target elements based on their parent. So this might be one of those elements that we query. We have these cards with some names, some description, price, and you can see that the layout of this card is changing, either one column or two column with the image on the left versus the top, based on its size, its parent size. And so when we're applying container queries, that might look like this, where we have a parent element that we're querying, and then that's the target element that is getting those styles applied. So if we put it all together, here's a little demo I built using container queries, and every single item in here, every single plant card is a container query, and it's the exact same code. So right here, this 2x grid, these little elements that are just kind of showing a preview, and then everything here, these are all the same exact code base, different images. And as I resize this, you can see that it's actually going to readjust based on the best layout within where it is on the page. Each of these elements owns its responsive styling. And if we inspect these elements, I'm just going to pop open DevTools for a minute. You can see that they're little queries with containers. And here you can see this container tag. And then as we resize this, is going to shift, and this product container here is going to readjust the styles. I'll show this a little bit more clear in a minute. So that's just one example of where you're seeing all of these container queries together. If we break it down, how do we build container queries? So here is a basic container. And again, I'm going to inspect this page where we have an element that has a 2-column layout grid. And then if I start to resize this, here's that primary container. It's going to start to readjust right about here and then shift into a 1-column layout. So there's the container that I'm querying. Then I have this element within it that has a grid layout. And you can see right here, it has an at container rule that says at a max width of 400 pixels, set the grid template columns to 1 fractional unit. So that's going to shift it from 2 units, so 1FR, 1FR, to just 1 column. And if I hover over this div.container in this container query here, you can see that the inline size, or the size going horizontally, is 369 pixels. So this is all Chrome dev tools that you can use today. I'm using Canary to showcase this presentation, but you can see how the default is grid template columns 1FR, 1FR. When I resize this a little bit smaller, it's going to shift, and there we have the container rule actually being called and being set. So in order to do this, the first thing that we have to do is to set containment on the parent. And what does that mean? It means that we have to set the container type. There's a few things that we can query. We can query style, we can query size, or we can query either inline or block size. In this presentation, I'm going to be using the terminology inline and block to mean the logical units that apply when we are specifying. Inline is going to be horizontal and block is going to be vertical. This might be what you're used to if you don't use logical properties in CSS, or you might be using top, right, bottom, and left when specifying things like padding, border, or margin. But when you're using logical properties, you get a lot of benefits that automatically take into account the writing mode and the directionality of the text. So instead of margin top, it's margin block start. And instead of margin right, it's margin inline end. So inline end is going to be the writing mode of the text. In something like English, or in Ukrainian, it's going to go left to right, and something like Arabic or Hebrew might go right to left, and then in some traditional Japanese languages, it might go top to bottom. So this automatically gives you some styling logic based on the language, and it's a better mental model when designing websites to think about logical properties, inline and block, instead of width and height. So that's just something to keep in mind. So once we've set the type of container on the parent, we then want to actually query that parent and apply the styles to its children. And the way that we do this is by setting at container. Here I'm setting at container with a max width 400 pixels, and then I'm applying things onto the card itself. So I can have a whole rule set here similar to media queries, where I can set container styles on card, on items within the card, and start to build and build and build from there. So what I can do then is set the grid template columns to 1FR, and that was the update that I made that I showed in DevTools. The default, you'd have to set a display grid. You would have to have it be by default 1FR, 1FR for the 2-column grid, and then I'm adjusting styles at a narrow width to just a single column grid. If you wanted to write this in a way that was mobile first, you could switch that around and say at container min width 400 pixels, set the default to be a single column, and then when you hit the minimum width, then that's when you update it to a 2-column grid. So you can do this in the same way that you would with media queries. The difference is that it's on the element. In that example, I showed you one element, so you might be thinking, can't you do that with a media query? And the answer is, in that case, yes, because we only had one element. Media queries query the full viewport, whereas container queries query individual parents within the viewport. So that becomes a lot more clear and powerful when we have multiple elements within this grid. So here I have the exact same code for all these elements. I just copied it and pasted it. I put this in a responsive grid. And as I resize it, you can see that these elements, based on their own responsive styling information, their own size, are going to, oh, I clicked something. This is what happens when I do code presentations. Let me just reopen that. Each one of those elements is going to look for the best possible solution based on how wide it is, not the viewport. When you're using the viewport to style it, then you only really get one answer at a time, right? You can only use that one piece of information to style everything on the page. But here with container queries, you can really look directly at the child itself and make a more informed decision. So back to where we are here. Now let's talk about named containers. Once we've set a container type, we can also set a container name on the parent. So we have this parent, we have the type, we have a name. You can write it out this way in the longhand. or you can write it with the shorthand of container. Container first takes the container name, so here we call it card parents, and then the container type inline size. This is just a shorthand way to write container queries. So this is really useful because you don't need to separate them. You can have all your information in one place. The other thing about this is the spec recently changed to swap these. So if you have container query demos, make sure that you either are setting container type to inline size or you are writing these correctly with the name first. So that's just like a heads up, spec change. This is an experimental technology that is going to be landing in browsers, but isn't quite in stable browsers yet. So then what we would do with the name is set at container, give it a name, and then apply the styles. And this is a better way to write container queries because it's more explicit, it's more clear what we're querying. With media queries, we don't run into this problem because we only are querying one thing at a time. We don't have to give it a name and keep track of everything. With container queries, you could have multiple things on the page querying different parents, and the best way to keep track of those is to give it a name. So it's always a best practice to give it a name. Now, one really cool thing is to use container queries with the has selector. Has is a selector that lets you look for children within a parent to style the parent. This is like a parent selector. So when you can use container queries and has, you can really have this intrinsic logical style that lives inside of the components themselves. And it's really cool to see it all together. Here's another example where I have this container query and this one, but I have one that has an image, so it's called visual, and I have one that doesn't have an image. When I don't have an image, I want the columns to just be vertical because I don't have anything here. But when I do have an image, I want it to be 2 across and wider screens or wider parent size. And then I want it to stack to the vertical layout, the one column layout, when there's less space. So we can now have this one component own all of this logic. This one component says that I know what to do based on my parent's size. At the same time, I know what to do when I don't have this image here. So this container doesn't have the image. This container card does have the image, and they look different based on the logical style. So here I'm using has, I'm saying if the card has the visual, set the grid template columns to 1FR, 1FR. And then I'm being super redundant here, and I am going to say if it doesn't have the visual, I also want to make sure that the font size is bigger, so that it takes up more space. And I can write card not has visual H1 and then set the font size. So I can combine has and not together in one selector to apply styles, which is like layering and layering logic and making really robust CSS styles because of it. So fluid typography is one example of where you might want to use the container query units. And this is a technique that has become pretty common. Fluid typography is a technique that lets you start with a minimum value, lets you set a maximum value, and then lets you set an actual value to test against. And the way that we can do this is by using the clamp function. Clamp is one of the great functions that CSS provides, along with min and max, that looks at these arguments and makes a decision, a logical decision based on the available size and information. So in this case, a lot of what we see now with fluid typography is using clamp to make sure that something can be flexible, but doesn't get smaller than a certain size, and it doesn't get bigger than a certain size, but in between those sizes, it can readjust and resize itself. This is a image from a Smashing Magazine article by Adrian Becce that I thought was really great as a way to kind of visualize what's going on here, where with the viewport, you can set a viewport relative unit, have it accept a minimum value, a maximum value, and then change sizes and be fluid in between those two values. So we can write it like this. We can say H1 clamp, give it a value of 2 rems, give it a minimum value of 2 rems, and then an actual value of 10 VW, and then a max value of 4 rems. So what that could look like is this. If we are inspecting this, just to show you again how that might appear, we have this H1, and here I am setting that font size, clamp minimum 2 rem, actual 10 VW, and then max 4 rem, so that it takes that forum size at large screens. As I start to bring this to a smaller size, it's fluid. See how it's slowly getting bigger and smaller here? Then when it hits the minimum right here, it's going to stop getting smaller. This text here, this heading, is going to stop getting smaller because I don't want it to get smaller than that. It's going to become illegible. It becomes the same size as this heading. So it's going to grow and grow and grow until it hits a maximum value of 4 rems. And it's going to shrink and shrink and shrink until it hits 2 rems as the minimum value. So that's a pretty cool technique that you can use. But that only works in the viewport. Luckily, we have container-based units that bring this to containers themselves. So similarly to how container queries query individual parents to apply styles, viewport units would query the wider viewport. Container query units query those containers. So we have a couple of new units. There's CQW and CQH, which use the absolute styles of width and height to query the container's width and height and apply a 1% value of that. Then there's CQI and CQB, which is the inline size and the block size of the container. And then there's also CQ minimum and CQ maximum, which would identify the smaller value of either the inline or block size or the larger value for CQ max. So now we've adjusted this example here, where as we're going to look at this heading, it's going to show us that we are using the CQI unit here, and it's going to do the same thing where it's looking at the size of the container itself to apply the styles instead of the viewport. So we have a much more finessed entry as we're designing this. So putting it all together now, I made this little space facts demo where I have all of these cards. I have these headings here, which don't have an image, that are accepting this CQ unit size. So here I'm not only setting the font size to clamp with CQ units, I'm also setting the font weight to be a little bit lighter, and I'm making it a little bit bigger, sort of putting it all together. I have the one here with the image that's going to be shifting from the 2x grid to the 1x grid, depending on its positioning in space. And then as I resize this, you can see that it's going to just be responsive and own its own responsive information. So I'm combining the has selector, container queries. I'm combining all of this logical styling, the not combinator, to be creating this really responsive grid layout that looks at its own styling information and creates this intrinsic logical styling. So this sort of pulls it all together. Now, in the future, we're going to have style queries. This is also a part of the Contain Level 3 spec, but in the initial implementation in Chromium and in WebKit, it's not going to be included just yet. And with style queries, some of the cool things that you can do is look at a parent style to make sure that if you're matching the style, you actually make it stand out. So for one example, if you had something like this, like a paragraph, and maybe an italicized quote inside the paragraph, you would want it to stand out from the rest of the paragraph. And that's why you would make it italic. If you had a block quote, for example, and you might already be styling it italic, but you want to have an element within it, like an I or a span, that makes it stand out, it's not going to look any different if you put an I in here, because it's just going to be applying an I style to that paragraph. But if you're using a style query, you can be really specific and say, if the container has a font style of italic, then I want to maybe give it a background of light pink or some other style. I could make it non-italic. And this way it will stand out from the rest of the code. So you can end up creating these chained styles. If style X, apply style Y. And you could apply it on any of these elements and queries for specific styles. Now, this also means that you can query for something like a border color. So here I'm looking for @container border color, and then I'm going to style the button within this card to also share the same border color. So you might be thinking, well, why not use a class for this or or something else. This becomes even more powerful when you take it a step further and abstract these to higher level variables like theme or is sold, and you can query container, you can query custom properties. So you can set an at container and look for the value, the string value of a custom property, and then style the entire card. So we can style the entire background and text and the button and all of these values within it when we query for custom property values. This lets you move some of the logic and styling and separate them. So if you wanted to update this logical value in JavaScript, you could do that and then apply all the styling in CSS where it makes sense to have those styles instead of update the styles in JavaScript. Another benefit here is that because this is CSS, you can update this in CSS. So if you had something like an active state or a focus state, you can update one place, this custom property value, and then apply these styles and style queries based on that. So that's where you can't do something with just a class name or an attribute when you're using these custom property values. So this isn't currently available, but it is a part of the spec and is coming down the pipeline. Another thing that's coming down the pipeline are state queries. This is a little bit further down in the future because it is part of the next level spec. The CSS working group moved it to the next level. And that would include things like identifying if some element is in a sticky position. Is it stuck? Identifying if it is currently snapped. Or in the future, we're also talking about possibly introducing anchor positioning and position sets in CSS. So you could possibly query if it's in a specific position set. This is a little bit more broad, not available yet, but sort of a way that the CSS working group and standard bodies are thinking about querying and responsive design and custom styling in CSS. So another great thing that you can do now is combine queries, where you could combine style, like size here. So you could set, inline size greater than 30 ems, and style queries like these custom property flags, responsive equals true. So now what we're saying is we want to query the container of card, which is the name that's given to that container. And then if that card has an inline size greater than 30 ems and it has a responsive custom property value set to true, then apply these styles. So you can see how this really grows and grows and grows as an entry point to responsive UI that allows for logical intrinsic styling that we just did not have in the past. This is really cool. I want to talk a little bit about container queries in production. There are some sites that are starting to use this. The current support is not there yet, but soon. It is currently behind a flag in Chromium, so you can use this in Chrome Canary or Chrome Stable, I believe, with the flag turned on. So you can go and go to the flags and make sure that you're enabling container queries, which is different from the experimental web platform features flag. So you can turn that on and then use container queries. It is also in the tech preview of WebKit. So that is going to be in version 16 plus, and it is not available in Firefox just yet, but you can use a polyfill to get some of these great effects. So with this browser support, I'm specifically talking about size queries and the container query units. It is not going to be style queries just yet, but you can do a lot of what you want to do with just size and container query units. This is an example of a site that uses the polyfill in production. It's the Chrome OS site, and all of these cards here, they are container query cards. So as I resize this, they own their own responsive styling information. They readjust their layout. Now it's a 2-column layout, and all of these are actual container query elements. You can go to chromeos.dev and play with it yourself. This uses the container query polyfill to make this work across browsers, modern browsers. So even if you're in a browser that doesn't support it yet, you'll still see the same results using Resize Observer. Another experimental site is DesignSember. That is designsember.com, where a lot of these little windows resize and reshape, and you can actually resize them yourself here. And this will readjust a couple of elements. I'll move around the page. It also uses the CQ polyfill to make these things work and adapt and be responsive. Now, I did mention the polyfill. The URL for that is on GitHub. If you look up Google Chrome Labs container query polyfill, it does have some caveats. So it uses resize observer, mutation observer, and it supports modern browsers. So Chromium 88 plus, Firefox 78 plus, and Safari 14 plus. This does have a couple of, I guess, downfalls where you can't currently use it with before and after pseudo elements. There's just a couple of asterisks here. So definitely check out the container query polyfill if you're interested in using container queries in production, but read through that list of gotchas before you actually use it. It is a very small polyfill. The whole idea was a tester, an example to see if this is something that we can support. But now it is being taken over and actively worked on to become a more robust polyfill. So this is going to be improved over the next few weeks and months. So don't worry about a lot of those caveats. They're going to be possibly fixed. So just watch out for that if you want to actually try out container queries. The benefits of container queries, I think I went through them a little, but I just want to conclude this talk by reiterating some of them. One of the biggest ones is reusable logical components. This is a site, bustle.com. It doesn't actually use container queries, but I just thought that it was a good example to show the power of container queries in modern UIs. So here, I was just envisioning the site, and possibly the way that we build websites in the future, just by default, is going to be this modular way where all of this could be the same component that shares the same logic and then looks for either a custom property value to adjust its styles. Maybe there's like a highlight or a showcase custom property value, or it looks for the size of its parent to apply styles. It can adjust typography sizing. It can adjust its layout. So this, I imagine, is going to be the way that we write logical responsive styles in the future using container queries. And the second benefit is that all of this is a self-contained logic. So again, in this example, this was the same code. You don't have to write multiple different types of components. They can own their own logical styling information depending on where they live. You've got your sidebar elements, your hero elements, these elements in the grid parent, and they all can readjust and restyle themselves based on the logic that you've applied once. Write once, see forever. And then finally, this works really well with component-based web architecture. So if you're using a tool like React, or if you're writing your code like this, where you have components and you have your styles and your logic sort of in the same folder, this allows you to really write it in a way that is component-based. And you don't have to worry about where things bleed into parents and how those parents send their styles into the children, because you need to look at the responsive elements of the page. And it's sort of mucky right now, the way that we have to do this for styling and sharing those styles across the UI. With container queries, you can write the logical style in one place, know where to find it, and it makes sense. So I hope that this talk showed you the power and the future of responsive styling in the web platform. I hope that you're really feeling like this, like I heart CSS. I'm really excited to see the stuff become stable. Hopefully we'll see that happen soon. And if you're interested in following along, you can follow me on Twitter. You can follow WebDevrel on web.dev and also on various places on the internet. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. But that is all I have today. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I will hop into the hop-in after this as well.
Thank you, Una, for this amazing presentation. That was really nice to, jump back to CSS, because I remember when I was front-end engineer, I was always bad with it. But it's, I enjoyed this speech.
There's a lot that's evolved. CSS has become very logical. There's functions. There's so much there to give developers the tools they need to make resilient, responsive UIs. It's an exciting time.
Oh, okay. So we got a couple of questions. Just for audience, Una will stay with us in the chat, so ask questions to her directly via our Hopin application. But we got a couple of it. So can I use a container with ID or only with classes?
Yes, you can use a container. Well, first you're querying the parent and setting a container, and then you can style anything. So you can style tags, you can style attributes, you can style IDs. Any way that you would select CSS now, you can apply when you're writing container queries.
Thank you. The other is, can you explain how this compares to mobile responsive web pages?
So are you saying like a mobile style sheet, like having an m.dot website? I hope that we don't need to do that anymore, because we can now write once and not have to keep two different code bases. This should help us do that even more efficiently by letting you have self-contained styles. But yeah, I definitely support one code base, one component base, and then just writing responsive styles that visually adjust without a separate domain. There might be other reasons for having a separate domain, but I hope that styling is not one of them.
Ooh, yeah, I still remember that we had like millions of CSS files for different, screens. And then you change something and you forget to change the same thing in the other file. And then your site looks bad for some of the users. So probably the final question on online is a lot of problems that container queries solve can be solved with grid or flexbox. What are the benefits of using container queries over already existing technologies?
That's a great question. Container queries don't actually help us solve what grid and flexbox can do. So you would be using them together, where you can use grid and flexbox to create layouts, and then the elements that you put within those layouts might need some customized responsive styles. So in the example that I showed, I used a grid with cards inside of it, and I wanted to make those cards look better in the grid. So they were querying their own column size to readjust the styles and look better in the grid. So I think that we'll be using a lot of Flexbox and grid with container queries, and making them work in unison. I think that they solve different things. They answer different questions.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks a lot once again, thanks a lot for this amazing presentation. Thanks a lot for supporting us and supporting Ukraine. Thank you for everything you're doing. And once again, thank you for the poster on your wall. That means a world for us. So Una, we will be switching to our next steps of our conference. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, people in the chat, please don't hesitate to ask the questions. And Una will answer while she has time, right? Thank you.
Yes, I will. I'll see you and hop in. Thank you so much. Thank you for putting this on.